Hi everybody, it's Melissa Woods. I'm in the middle of painting a room right now, and I thought I would stop and share with all of you my best tips and tricks for painting a room like a pro. The first thing you're going to want to do is prep your room. For me, that included filling any holes and gouges in the wall with something that's sandable, whether that be wood filler or joint compound. You can also caulk all your seams and then prime. So I primed the whole room and now I'm painting. You also want to prep yourself by putting on your dirty paint clothes and getting your hair out of the way so you don't get paint in it. A lot of people use drop cloths and painter's tape in the room as well. I did a little bit of that, but in general, I just don't drip that much, so I'm not going to have as much protection on the floors as others might. This is also a reason that I don't choose to spray when I paint. I think with my techniques, my paint job can look almost as good as a sprayer's paint job, and I have next to no prep work. Whereas when you spray, you have a ton of areas you have to tape off, plastic, and there's always overspray. You always get spray in your eyes and on everything, so I just don't like to do it. You're also going to want to take off outlet plates, or switch plates. Obviously, ignore this, it's getting replaced. And you're going to want to remove or tape off registers, heat registers, things like that. I did add one layer of painter's tape along the floor just for the baseboards to make that a little easier for myself. Now, the first thing I recommend is to edge in all of your brushwork. And I'm going to show you how to cut in and get a nice straight line. And I'm also going to show you near the end of this video my favorite tip for getting a very crisp paint line with painter's tape. And it's not your typical painter's tape trick. It's definitely something I think isn't well known, so stay tuned. First, let's talk about your brush when you're cutting in. You don't want both sides of your brush to be full of paint, you just want one. So I'm going to wipe off one of my sides so I have a clean edge. Always use a high quality brush. Mine is Wooster brand. I love this brand. It also helps to use an angled brush. Okay, so now you have one side loaded, one side clean. You're going to offload your paint near the edge. Then you're going to take your clean side and stick the bristles into your edge and cut down just like that. You'll notice it took paint off here, and that's okay. We're going to go over that again. I'm going to show you just like that. And then in the corner, you just come down from the opposite direction, stick your bristles down, and pull up. See that? That is near perfect. Now you don't want to work with too much paint on your brush because then your paint will, get drips, or it will start to slide and glob down where you have your edge, where you want a nice crisp edge. So my recommendation is that you should not try and brush in only 2 coats. You don't want to try and cut in only 2 coats. It's going to probably take 3. But one thing you can do to prevent yourself from having to brush in 3, especially if you're using like a medium color instead of like just white or black. With white or black, you're probably going to need 3 coats for total opacity. But one thing you can do is, once you've done all those cut-ins, just come again over it with the flat side of the brush and just even out what you've done. You know what I mean? So we don't see as many brush strokes. There. Alrighty, now let's roll. Similar to the brush, you never want to buy cheap materials. I like to use Purdy brand, or at Menards they have Masters brand. That's a good one. It's a 3/8 inch nap, 9-inch roller. And I always choose polyester fabric in the lint-free version. The fabric rollers can be kind of yucky if you buy a cheap one, so don't skip on your tools. I feel like if you buy a foam type roller, they just tend to drip easier. So make sure that you're investing in good tools in order to get a drip-free, great paint finish. Obviously you want to roll it out in your pan You never want there to be globs of wet paint sitting on your roller. Also make sure to pay attention to the ends, that end and that end, and roll those nicely because that's where the paint tends to sit, and that's almost always what causes your drips. When you start laying paint, I like to lay paint in a cross motion over large areas. Now, this is not always the case if I'm coming up against an edge. I'll roll in a straight line. If you're rolling a ton of rooms at once, I'd recommend getting not just a long handle like this, but like one of the broom handles that hooks in, like a really long extension handle. Makes things go a lot faster. The reason you cut in first is because you want to feather your paint that you roll into the edges. So especially when you're painting alone like me, a lot of times by the time you get to rolling, your edges are already dry. So the way you get the dry paint to look good with your rolled paint is that you come and take the end of your roller, which does not produce a totally solid line, and you just carefully roll that near where your brush stroke stopped. Probably just once, honestly, and that kind of feathers it out. Now, as best you can, you always want to keep a wet edge, so when you're rolling, you want to continue rolling the wet edge. You don't want to leave an edge to dry, especially in a super visible spot like the middle of your wall. Make sure to bleed your wet edges together by going in that crosshatch motion, so it's not obvious where you stopped painting with one roller and started again with a fresh one. A couple more common mistakes. So when you lift up your roller, you don't want to just pick it up. It's going to leave a ridge of paint. So you need to roll it off, adjusting the pressure as you go so that when it lifts off the wall, it's like the lightest of pressure and you won't see any spot where you lifted your roller up off the wall. You never ever want to go back onto an area you've already rolled because as it dries, you're seeing spots you missed. Doesn't matter if you missed a spot, never ever go back and add more paint as your paint is in the process of drying. The light can trick you, and a lot of times you have better coverage than you think and you can't tell until it's dry. Even so, if you did miss a spot, you still should wait until the coat is dry and come back in with a whole other coat and then feather out the area around where you added more paint. Because if you do it in the middle of when the dry time is, it's just going to be obvious. Or you might pick up paint off the wall around it that's like not fully adhered yet. Now, if you buy a really good quality roller, you won't have this problem as much. But one thing I also do every so often, every 10 minutes or so when I'm rolling, is I turn my roller like this and I get the buildup off of the end. This end too, because that's kind of where you tend to get paint glumping, drying, and is a huge culprit of drips. Another pitfall to watch out for is little things in your paint. A lot of times it can be lint from your roller, but if you're using a good roller, you won't have that problem. You might still have the problem of little bits of dry latex in your paint. Sometimes when paint, even when it's brand new, when paint dries slightly, or it's been sitting on the shelf at the store too long, the latex can kind of congregate into little globs, and when you roll it out, they go on your wall. So if you see those, just pick them off when your paint's wet and then roll over that spot again. If you miss them, you're going to have to scrape them off before your next coat, and it'll just not look as good. The last thing I want to talk to you about is primer. Now, the paint I'm using is a paint and primer in one, just like every other paint on the shelves these days. Paint and primer in one doesn't necessarily mean you can skip the priming step. It kind of depends. To me, what that means is that your paint has exceptional adhesion and that you might not need to use a primer if you're covering like latex over latex. Whenever you're covering raw material, raw lumber, or if you, in my case, I put like yucca board, hardboard up on these walls and that's a raw material, that needs to be primed before you can paint it, even if you're using a paint and primer in one. You also definitely want to prime if you're not sure what the paint is that you're covering. So if it could be like oil-based paint, or like it's a really old house, you're covering old walls. Again, my situation, you always want to prime just to be sure, because latex paint will not react nicely and stick to oil-based paint walls. You will also need to prime if you are covering like Sharpie walls or a super dark color like black and you're trying to make it light like white. So basically there are a lot of circumstances in which you want to prime anyway, and when in doubt, I just prime the wall and then I do the paint, even if the paint has a primer in it. Another thing I'll say about paint, and I could literally talk about paint qualities on and on, but another one that gets you, and you just have to know when you're painting a room, is that there's really no such thing as one coat coverage. Not if you want a good paint job. I am a really good painter. I'm very even when I roll things out and when I brush, and I just am never happy enough, even when I use a very thick paint that promises one coat coverage and I pay extra for that quality. I'm just never happy enough with the way it looks until I do that second coat. So in my opinion, don't pay extra for the one coat coverage. Just buy a medium quality paint and do 2 coats. So while I can cut in well, sometimes I have a dark color meeting a very light color and I want an extremely crisp paint line. So what I do is I do use painter's tape on the very last coat. This has 2 coats on it and this has 1 coat on it. So I'm going to be putting my last coat of white on the trim, and it's going to look perfect because what I do is I use delicate surface frog tape. This type of tape is important because it's meant for surfaces that are dried at least 24 hours. I let my second coat on the blue dry for 2 full days, and that will make sure it's fully adhered before I put tape on and risk wrecking it. So rip a manageable size. Then I'm going to lay it down sticky side up so that I can find the corner or the edge, and then tip it up and press your tape. You can see that I overpainted with the blue slightly, and this was intentional. You want to slightly overpaint with the color that you're going to be taping off. Now you're going to paint the color that you taped off on the edge of the tape. And we're using the color to seal the tape instead of other methods. I've seen wet washcloths. I've seen like people press down on the edge of the tape with credit cards. All the other methods have some level of bleed through. So this method, you're working with the tendency to bleed through under the tape instead of against it, because anything that bleeds through is going to be the blue color that you're okay with it being. Okay, now you start painting the white or your lighter color. You start painting your second color over the tape. Next, I'm going to come in with a second coat for full opacity. Then after you let your paint dry just a little bit, I let mine dry about half hour. You can let it dry longer too, but I'm impatient. Then you can peel off the tape. And you want to peel slowly. Sometimes if you go too fast, you can really grab a lot of paint off. But I'm going to let the line speak for itself. Is that not perfect? There you go. Follow these tips and tricks and you will have everyone and their mother asking you to come help them paint. I'm not joking. So if you learned something, let me know in a comment below what that was. And if you thought this video was helpful, you can support me by subscribing to my channel or coming to follow me on Instagram. The link is in the description on this video. Anything that I talked about in here, products or things you're wondering about, you might be able to find there as well. But if not, then just go ahead and ask a question below and I'll try and answer it for you. Thank you guys all so much for watching Welcome to the Woods. We'll catch you again next time. Bye-bye!